So, we're here today to answer the question, do women have brains? And we will do that by looking at sexism in academia and feminist autotheory with a touch of neuroscience. So, a disclaimer before I begin. The speaker is aware of being a straight white cis male talking about feminism, and so I went for quotes by feminist academics to avoid unintentional appropriation and mansplaining. Having said that, let's begin. So let's talk about Lauren Fournier. She's a scholar, curator, filmmaker, and she has written a monograph titled Autotheory as a Feminist Practice in Writing, Criticism, and Art. So autotheory, what is it exactly? But before I get into that, can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can indeed.
Great. So, okay, autotheory. What is autotheory exactly? Well, it's a mixture of autobiography and theory, but this raises the question what theory is exactly. So, we'll take a look at Jordan Alexander Stein in his book Avidly Reads Theory. The epigraph by Stuart Hall says theory is always a detour on the way to something more important. And Stein himself says that without the inspiration of theory, without the years spent thinking and talking and being and becoming theory, he would have no idea who he would be today. So Stein's real objective in his book is not to explain what theory is, but how theory feels when you engage with it. So theory is certainly personal, it seems, but to give a definition of it also, theory is a way of thinking and talking about language, power, and history, drawing on a canon of mostly European educated scholars, philosophers, and psychoanalysts, the likes of Derrida, Lacan, Kristeva, Foucault, and Barthes, or as we call them all, theorists. So what is autotheory? Fournier gives a definition. Autotheory describes works of literature, writing, and criticism that integrate autobiography with theory in ways that are direct and self-aware. Note the term self-aware for later. So autotheory is something larger than its parts, something larger than just a mixture of autobiography and theory. It is actually autobiography about theory and theory about autobiography at the same time. And if we take a look at the history of autotheory, we can see why Lauren Fournier says that it's a feminist practice, but it's not obvious at once. So at first, when you look at the facts of the late 20th century in academia, it seems to be quite the opposite, that autotheory is all bad feminist, because autobiography is a man's sport, because a woman's life isn't important enough to read about, and theory is also a man's sport, because women apparently are emotional beings that cannot reach the high levels of reason privy only to the male brain. So now let's carefully look at another description of autotheory by Fournier to understand why we describe it as a feminist practice. So working autotheoretically emerges out of and crystallizes through women and women's bodies as living and thinking in a world that, given patriarchal structures, might be hostile to them. At its core, autotheory is radical, egalitarian, and accessible, and it allows those who are living their lives reflexively to theorize and to engender knowledge and insight from the specificities of their body minds. Now, another disclaimer, when we talk about women, we're also including non-binary and gender non-conforming persons, and generally any group that is excluded in any way. So, Fournier's previous passage describes three important elements of autotheory. The first one, women's bodies. So, the body remembers too. The body must be memoir too, not just the mind, especially if said body has functioned as a locus of oppression for millennia. Also, hostility of the patriarchy. The foremothers of Autotheory in the late 20th century needed an escape from a patriarchal system so pervasive that it dictated even how they talked about themselves. And the third one is egalitarian. So Autotheory is accessible to everyone, and as we will see later on, the more suppressed your story is, the more valuable it ends up being. So, Autotheory, good or bad? So Fournier makes a distinction between good Autotheory and bad Autotheory, obviously in a much more eloquent way, but we'll just call it that. So good Autotheory. In some ways, Autotheory is the perfect way to study selfhood because it mixes both the practice and the theory of studying the self, both autobiography and, well, theory, in a fashion that is intertwined. So on one hand, autobiography is important in the quest of finding yourself or rebuilding yourself. On the other hand, theory offers new perspectives to the practice of autobiography. For example, Poletti speaks of Butler's performative, and John Paul Ekin talks about the narrator and where he resides in the process of narration, and lots of other interesting stuff. So, good Autotheory. Autotheory is radical. It was a radical practice in the 90s because it marked a shift from the work of feminist precursors. Autotheory criticized male colleagues because they didn't acknowledge subjectivity and gendered and racial aspects in the research. And finally, Autotheory distances itself from the masculine logic and signification. Helen Cixous found theory back then to be an essentially masculine enterprise of power through knowledge. So Autotheory should exist in the place where self intersects with people or communities or citations, because Autotheory is predicated on the self, yet intends on being sociological and political. Fournier quotes Michael Silverblatt, a literary critic and radio show host of Bookworm, discussing a piece of Autotheory and saying, these pieces use theory and at the same time go beyond it. We discover that what we know about the world theoretically is also manifested in the world actually. And as Fournier beautifully puts it, the singular can be a gateway to the multiple, and theorizing together we might, after all, hear ourselves. So let's talk about bad Autotheory. Autotheory is prone to the questionable logics of late postmodernism coming full circle, meaning my truth is truth and your truth is your truth. Autotheory also seems prone to the logic of the most militant forms of intersectional thinking. For example, I am the most marginalized, so I will be the only one to speak. And maybe the most obvious problem in Autotheory is that it edges too close to solipsism, to an unproductive form of narcissism. So, narcissism. It sounds like a bad thing, but because it's a slur, it's a personality disorder, and it's a cautionary tale from mythology. So it sounds bad, but is it bad? We will see that it's not necessarily bad. So around the 60s, feminist art started embodying narcissistic subjectivity, as Fournier says. So the feminist intention was to reclaim narcissism as a practice, to reread it as a self-reflexive feminist approach with a radical and destabilizing potential for subversion in the patriarchal world of art and writing. So, from Aristotle to Descartes, women's bodies have been irreconcilable with the rational mind. Social norms and stereotypes present logic as the male domain, while women rule in emotion land. So radical narcissism became a feminist reaction against patriarchy, basically. So Fournier comments on an art installation of a peer of hers titled "I'm Too Self-Aware to Be a Narcissist," about which she writes, "A distinction between narcissism on the one hand and self-awareness on the other." And so my conclusion to this issue of narcissism is that the criterion for good or bad Autotheory is self-awareness. When you lack self-awareness, that's when it's narcissism. So let's talk about Chris Kraus. Chris Kraus is a hallmark figure of Autotheory. Her debut in '97 was provocatively titled. You will read it because I won't say it. So the story follows Kraus and a fellow mysterious academic named Dick. He's a real person, by the way. So the book consists of love letters sent in real life by the obsessed Kraus to the indifferent Dick. So here's Kraus in her book describing a female academic who might or might not be her alter ego, called Gabi Tesh. So people were afraid of her. She forgot how to teach her classes. She became that word that people used to render difficult and driven women weightless. She was quirky. So imagine what the word quirky signifies for women, and now do the same but for men. And personally, I didn't get like the similar results in my mind. So Kraus says that the word quirky takes difficult and driven women and renders them weightless. It's as if it's a spell. So in Letter to Dick, when they've sort of established a rapport, Kraus says in passing something interesting. She says, "At any rate, in order not to feel this hopelessness, regret, I've set myself the job of solving heterosexuality, that is, finishing this writing project before turning 40, and that's tomorrow." So Kraus tries obsessively, urgently, and narcissistically to address problematics of the female condition in a patriarchal environment where women are automatically assigned a role intellectually inferior merely due to their deviation from male logic. Kraus is the narrator of her past and her feelings, but at the same time she's a rigorous critical thinker debating the role of women in the not too progressive 90s art world. So Kraus often indulges in emotionalism, yet maintains critical distance from emotion, as if she can tap into the intensity and still avoid the judgment clouding. So her aphorisms in the book mostly concern her effort to communicate her inner world to the world outside, but this effort doesn't go well every time. So she says, "Exegesis, the crazy person's search for proof that they're not crazy. And isn't sincerity just the denial of complexity?" Kraus was prescient too. She wrote in '97, mind you, "What happens between women now is the most interesting thing in the world because it's least described." And this statement actually summarizes the point I'll make in this presentation 25 years later, and also describes a literary trend that emerged in the following years after Kraus and which still goes strong today. So this is Autotheory, its highlights at least for the 21st century. We have Paul Persiado, we have Maggie Nelson, we have Kate Zambrino, all of them wonderful writers. I highly recommend you read those books. So now let's talk about Alison Gopnik. Alison Gopnik is a psychologist, a philosopher, and a professor, and she has written the fantastic Philosophical Baby, where she exposes a curious fact of philosophy. Up until the recent decades, there have been practically no mentions of babies in philosophy, which is strange, because babies are a huge part of life, let alone they're basically bundles of potential for metaphysical studies. But when you think about it, it's not really strange that there are no babies in philosophy. Because here's something you never see in old photographs. Fathers taking care of babies. Because until recently, a philosopher was almost certainly a man, and men didn't take care of babies. That was a woman's job, which probably had something to do with the emotional female brain, right? So back to Gopnik, the matter of babies becomes a beautiful example of how the whole research community can miss out on an intellectual treasure simply out of social stereotypes. Apparently, stereotypes can overpower the famous reason and logic of the male brain. So, Gopnik speaks about selfhood and its relationship to story. So, scholars and psychiatrists alike have argued that selfhood more or less consists of stories. The advantage of a coherent story of the world is that it allows you to entertain counterfactuals, to imagine ways in which the world might be different. And apparently, research has shown that the more stable your story, the more mentally resilient you end up being. So conversely, the more suppressed your story gets, you can imagine that all kinds of problems psychologically arise. So Alison Gopnik co-writes a column in the Wall Street Journal called Mind and Matter with Robert Sapolsky, who is also a straight white cis male, but he's really worth mentioning here. So let's talk about Robert Sapolsky and mostly his book Behave, The Biology of Humans at Our Best and Worst. So, Robert Sapolsky is a professor of biology at Stanford. His recorded lectures have made him a YouTube star. Truly worth watching, I do mean it. So Sapolsky is famous for lecturing on depression and engaging the public about testosterone and like debunking myths about testosterone and how supposedly it's what causes male aggression and all that. So, in my opinion, his most important contribution is what he calls buckets. So Sapolsky's buckets are a metaphor for categorical thinking, like putting your thoughts into buckets, or basically means being unable to think in non-binary terms, being unable to think in spectrums. So Sapolsky doesn't like categorical thinking, and personally I think that he has made it his mission to eradicate it from our minds. So an example is that an example he presents, is that people thought it was a research-proven biological fact that men are better than women at math, that it was gene-based, and there was actually research for that. But it was utterly misguided, and that's because of buckets in our brains. Because what Sapolsky has proven, both about testosterone and other like biological traits, like math skills, which is based on genes, so it's biological. He actually has proven that it's all context dependent. So new research actually debunked the old results about women being inferior in math, supposedly. So due to this long detour, you might have forgotten how we started talking about Sapolsky in the first place. So it was about Alison Gopnik, and before the detour we were talking about the importance of storytelling in the process of forming a selfhood. So on this matter, Sapolsky writes, "One of the greatest wellsprings of resistance is to seize back the narrative. A major step towards victims' resistance is to gain the power to define themselves." So to circle back to the beginning, if autotheory cannot help an author seize back the narrative, then I don't know which genre can, and that's why we're studying it. So, a quick recap. So, feminist academics around the 90s needed to articulate, communicate, and express their interior lives, their lived experiences, and subsequently have their existence finally legitimized by the patriarchal society. And now, a seemingly entirely unrelated detour on altered states of consciousness. So, altered states of consciousness, or ASCs, as I'll call them, are mind states that make individuals experience reality in an altered way, which can range from like slightly altered to drastically altered. The most well-known and well-studied ASCs are meditation, psychedelics, neurological syndromes, dreaming, and virtual reality. So, ASCs are interesting for many reasons, but especially because in the 21st century neuroscience, ASCs have become this tool for shutting down the part of our brains responsible for the ego, and then seeing what happens. So imagine your ego network shuts down, and suddenly, and for a while, you forget what it's like to be a self. You cease being an individual. You become one with everything. You merge with the city, with nature, with the universe. And in case all this sounds weird and unpleasant, here's a list of scientifically proven benefits. So DMN is the scientific name for the ego network, basically. So if you think less of yourself, if you recognize that we are all in some sense one, if you recognize that selfhood is in some sense an illusion. If you try to be here now, if you manage to think in spectrums, and if you embrace diversity and inclusion, all these are behaviors that sort of lower the activity of the DMN network and lead to better mental health. Let's talk about James Kingsland. So he's an acclaimed science writer, and he has an excellent book on ASCs called Am I Dreaming? Now, according to Kingsland, ASCs have an effect on our brains similar to rebooting our computer to fix some of its software cluttering. This rebooting seems to be beneficial to mental illness. Like our computers, our brains need a reboot once in a while. REM sleep would be a good example of that. REM is the phase of sleep where information is consolidated, basically. So REM sleep would be a good example of that, because the human brain, when deprived of REM sleep for a few days, starts going mad, because the metaphorical hard drive in your mind starts to clutter. And while we're on the subject, here's a list of ego network-related mechanisms of mental illness. A rigid need for control, your mind residing in the past and the future too much, fear creeping underneath every emotion. Those are states that heighten the activity in the DMN and lead to mental illness. David Kessler writes about this. He's a highly esteemed psychiatrist and author. Kessler, in his book Capture, tries to come up with a unified theory of mental illness. That is a system in the brain that can explain all kinds of mental illness. And while he doesn't exactly prove this, the ego network looks like a good candidate for that sort of unified theory. Heightened activity in the DMN is responsible for depression, stress, rumination, and other evils. So now let's take a trip back to Alison Gopnik. Gopnik discusses traveling in her book, which, according to cliche, broadens the mind. Gopnik discusses traveling because, in the end, she concludes that the cliches might have scientific value in them. So it turns out that traveling works like some ASCs do, particularly the phenomenology of traveling is basically similar to that of meditation. So when traveling, there is a great deal of new information available at once, but not a chance for the brain to take it all in. So it's a sort of pleasant deluge for the brain. So the point I'm trying to make is this. If traveling can work as an altered state of consciousness, can't autotheory do the same? Because doesn't reading in general teleport us to the foreign lands of another person's psyche and critical perspective? And in that process of teleportation, aren't we also deluged with information, images, and feelings? So here we reach the overarching argument of this presentation. I see parallels between altered states of consciousness and autotheory, because both of them have some common characteristics. Diversity of personal stories is important, it seems, in both of them. Acquiring new data is helpful, and rebooting the brain is vital. And exercising control over your own story is paramount to mental health. So, trying to see reading as an altered state of consciousness. When reading, we transport ourselves in some other place as some other person, much like traveling, which has ASC-like properties, but we already discussed that. Let's see what Ursula K. Le Guin says. Consider how in the process of reading we forget we're reading an invention, a history that never took place anywhere, but in that unlocalizable region, the author's mind. In fact, says Le Guin, while we read a novel, we are insane, bonkers. We believe in the existence of people who aren't there. We hear their voices. We might join a battle, be killed, or we may even become Napoleon. So let's talk a bit about Ursula Le Guin. She can be considered a feminist literary icon because, first of all, she was one of the first women, if not the first, after Mary Shelley to create such shockwaves in the fantasy and sci-fi worlds in literature. And also, she wrote The Left Hand of Darkness, where a species of humans alternates between the male and the female biological sex. So as you can understand, and also I think it was in the 70s, it was way before anyway. So again, discussing the purpose of writing in sci-fi in particular, argues that she's not trying to predict the future, rather she's trying to explain the present. And that's why she chose to write about androgynous entities, not androgynous actually, this should be saying hermaphrodite, but sorry. And she chose to write about it not because she predicts this as her future, but rather because she believes that under certain conditions we are already like that. So my opinion is that Le Guin saw gender equality and gender change even as a latent inherent element in all of us. So we speak of reading and of the mechanisms of fiction, but what constitutes good fiction? The feeling of good fiction is ineffable. If you don't believe me, go ahead and try to explain what it feels like to read an amazing book. Yes, you can describe it in a roundabout way, practically writing a short essay on it, but you cannot pin it down with words exactly, thus ineffable. So Le Guin says the novelist says in words what cannot be said in words. When we read something good, we get to feel like we've changed a little, like we're different than we were before we read it, but it's very hard to say just what we learned, how we were changed. So one could say that through fiction and literature in general, one can access levels of reality inaccessible through other means. But that happens in altered states of consciousness as well, right? So if we were trying to describe good fiction, we would say that it's like an altered states of consciousness. So that's why I read Autotheory as parallel to altered state of consciousness neuroscience, because both Autotheory and ASC's research shows that there are hidden treasures of neuroscientific knowledge in unexplored phenomenological territories, like women, babies, altered states, traveling, reading, all those states are practically unexplored. Through feminism and the expression of previously silenced female voices, we unearth truths about psychology and society. So concluding, according to research in neuroscience, us humans have an inbuilt tendency to think in terms of us and them, also called the in-group and the out-group. So it seems to be a general rule that when we dig deeper into the subjective experience of diverse individuals, the thems, we are usually led to a new and better understanding of how we work, the us. And the more open-mindedly and non-judgmentally we examine the experiences and the differences they have from us, the better understanding we gain about both groups. So stories and theory of the excluded and the oppressed allows us a new view of the world, a shot from a more panoramic angle, which is bound to be more informed, more real than our default mode of perceiving. Autotheory, authored by a diverse group, might not be an altered state of consciousness per se, but it does alter your state of consciousness. Which brings us to our last slide. Behaviors characterized by low activity in the ego network carry mental health benefits for both us and them. That's a good incentive for us to respect difference and diversity, if one needs incentive for that. Thank you.